So I'm Whitney, and I'm a designer and developer from Greenville, South Carolina. That's on the East Coast in the United States. I work for Home Depot Code Center, and my job is to translate design thinking into user-friendly code. Whoops, too fast. If you have questions, I'm happy to take questions at the end of the talk. If you have questions that come to you later after you've sort of thought about what I've said for a little bit, you can always tweet me on Twitter. I'm pretty responsive there. And I'm really excited to be here today to spark a conversation about the legacy of the JavaScript community. And I've talked to a couple of people about, what does this talk mean? What does it contain? And I'm really excited to sort of get started here. So I'd like to start with a story. When I was a little kid, my mom always would help me brush my hair because I was just terrible at brushing my hair. I mean, I looked horrible. And so every morning when my mom would help me brush my hair, I'd ask her the same question. And the question that I always asked was, Mom, what am I going to be when I grow up? And every morning she'd give me a different answer. And so sometimes she would say, well, Whitney, you could be a farmer, or maybe you could be a teacher, or maybe you could be a fireman, or a scientist, or an astronaut. And I thought that those were all really, really cool. And every morning she gave me this different answer. And one day I realized, gosh, she's not actually going to tell me. She doesn't know. And that's sort of something that I've thought about a lot as JavaScript sort of grows up, as JavaScript sort of gets started and starts to be taken as a more serious language. What is the result of that? Like, what do we want to be? What do we want our community to be when we grow up? So I think really it was these conversations with my mom that cemented that I could be anything. And the reason I tell that story is I think it really cements how small actions can have a really, really big impact. So it seems like a sort of trivial thing to tell you about, brushing my hair when I grew up. But I think that in a world that's so wrapped up in immediacy, in seeing things like right now, in shaving off milliseconds of, improved performance, it really takes a lot of thinking to sort of realize that the stuff that we're doing, the actions that we're taking right now may seem really trivial, but in reality, when we're making actions in the community, when we're sort of doing things and shaping the community, it could take a week, it could take a month, it could even take years for these actions and these patterns to sort of show their face in the community. It could take a long time. And they could be really significant in ways that we might not have imagined. So what I want to tell you about today is how our community needs leaders and how you can be one of those leaders. So as the JavaScript language and the community of people who embrace it grow, it becomes ever more apparent that we also need this sort of kind, gentle guidance that my mom gave me. Not something that's dictatorial or mean or sort of telling you everything you need to know, but just really friendly and saying, gosh, you could do this, you could do that, there is no right answer. You can kind of take it where you want to go. And so what I think is that the leadership of the JavaScript community probably should not come from one single person. It shouldn't come from a standards body. It shouldn't come from one organization, but instead it should come from a group of people. What it should come from is leadership by the many and not by the few. And the reason I think that's really important is because it's not the task of just one or two people. It's actually the task of everyone to determine the legacy of the JavaScript community. And so when we say this word legacy, what does legacy really mean? A lot of times when we're talking about software and we think about the word legacy, what immediately comes to mind is the idea of legacy code. And anytime I say legacy code to someone, immediately people have this gut reaction of ooh, legacy code is not something that a lot of people are excited to work on. They're not really excited to support it. And so we associate it with things that are old. We associate it with things that are broken. We associate it with things that are sort of no longer relevant. And it's almost always negative. But the word legacy it came about in the 14th century. And when it originally came about, the word legacy had a completely different meaning. And that meaning was much more affirmative. And the meaning was a body of persons sent on a mission. And that's pretty different from something that's old, crusty, and we don't want to support it anymore. And the reason I think that this is really, really key is because this is who we are as JavaScripters. This is who we are as a coding community, and whether you write JavaScript or not, whether you just sort of deal with JavaScript on the internet, I think that the future of our language and the community that's surrounding it is super, super important. And so being a part of this legacy, being a part of the leadership is really, really critical. And it's critical for two reasons. First, I think it gives us a sense of agency and empowerment. And when I say agency and empowerment, what I mean is that we don't need to wait for the permission of someone else to take charge. We're not sort of waiting on our mom or our dad to say, hey, hold my hand, we're going across the street. Instead, we're sort of taking our own ability and saying, gosh, I think I can do this. I can do this on my own. And that's really amazing, because it means that JavaScript, and as developers in the wider coding community, we really have the ability to shape and influence the direction of JavaScript, not only as a language, but as a community. We can really shape it on our own. And second, I think it ensures that by being active participants, by really contributing back to the community, by contributing to open source software, by mentoring junior developers, by going to conferences and talking to people rather than just sort of staying in our own bubbles, what happens is that instead of just sort of being these passive bystanders where we're always taking things from other people, taking from the community, we don't sort of just always take, but instead we do the hard work of the caretaking ourselves. We do the hard work of inclusion. We do the hard work of continuously sort of working on the language and the people and making things better. And each one of us is sort of in this same boat. And I think that's really amazing. So if I had to put the legacy of the JavaScript community into two words, these are the ones that I would choose: purpose and people. And to put it simply, the legacy of JavaScript can be understood in these two words, because when I say people, I mean the people who use JavaScript, the people who write JavaScript, the people who interact with JavaScript. And I don't just mean developers, I mean a pretty broad group of people. And then the purpose is everything else. So the purpose is the code, the purpose is the conferences, the purpose is JavaScript may be your career, it may be the future of the language itself, maybe you're determining the next new feature of JavaScript, and that's super amazing. But when we think about all of these things, when we think about conferences, when we think about the future of the language itself, it's really easy to get mixed up. And so I think what we need to always remember is that it should be people first, always. And not language first, not conferences first, not earning money first or having a job first, but JavaScript is really about people. And I think whether you're a JavaScripter, whether you're a front-end developer or a back-end developer, regardless of what language you write, I think what's really, really important is to understand that all of this code stuff, all of this talking stuff about development and how we can make things faster, better, stronger, more secure, that stuff is all really great, but the purpose of coding is to make things for people. So I think defining the legacy in this way, we really understand that it's people first. So when I'm talking about this, how do we sort of define our vision? How do our languages about the legacy of JavaScript and the community, what does that even mean? And maybe it makes more sense to sort of step back for a little bit and look at our history. So JavaScript has been really, really important. It's a foundational technology of the web. And despite this central role, a lot of people sort of tend to look down on JavaScript as a lesser language. And sometimes they sort of ridicule it, or sometimes it's sort of relegated to a lesser language in a supporting role. And sometimes even developers who write JavaScript primarily are considered to be sort of less than or not as good as developers who write in a different language. And I think it's sort of silly. And a lot of times, maybe it's that JavaScript is relatively easy to use. It's relatively easy to get started with. And so we sort of use this as evidence that, oh, it must be somehow inferior. And I think that's just, it's wrong. So I would actually say that JavaScript is pretty nuanced and complex. And when we boil it down to these really, really simple things, what it comes down to is that JavaScript is incredibly subtle. And when we look at the language itself reveals itself to be nuanced and complex. And actually, that's reflected in our community. When you look at us, we don't all look the same. We don't all talk the same. We don't all come from the same place. We're maybe not all actually JavaScripters primarily. Maybe we're writing a lot of .NET or C# or something else primarily, but JavaScript is still a part of this. And so it's really easy on the surface to say, oh, I know what's going on. I know what people are doing. And it's easy to ascribe to us these really easy cliches, but I think that that's a mistake because they're not, first of all, they're not true, but they're actually pretty harmful and they're very limiting. So if we sort of brush all of this silly stuff aside, who are we really as developers? Who are we really as JavaScripters? Who are we really as a community? And what does that mean in the modern age? And I would say that community in its simplest form can just be defined as a group of members who share common characteristics or interests and who often possess a common cultural and historical heritage. And when I say common cultural and historical heritage, maybe a couple of you thought, I don't know that I can buy into this. And so I think when we sort of look at the word community, when we take a superficial glance, it can sort of take us in the wrong direction. And so looking out at you today, I can see that we have incredible diversity. And we have people of all ages, we have people of all genders, we have people of all backgrounds and beliefs, and we speak different mother tongues, and we have different countries printed on the front of our passports. And maybe for some of you, the country that's printed on your passport is actually not the one that you identify most with. And I think it's probably just that all of these different things, all of this diversity, they paint a really interesting and detailed story. And so after having talked with all of you and after having watched a couple of the speeches, I think what's really clear is that the interests and the characteristics that we share revolve around programming. They revolve around JavaScript. They revolve around this need to build and create and make things. And so what I would say is our common heritage is not genetics, but instead our common heritage is not a physical place or a spoken language, but it's a belief in the power of the web. And most importantly, it's not despite these differences that JavaScript and the coding community at large are so interesting. It's actually because of these differences that the mission of the web is so important. So I think really what we need to think about is that we have to create the culture that we want. The web is here to stay, and JavaScript is probably here to stay. And so as individuals in this community, I think we're obligated to create and maintain a culture. We're obligated to create ideas and beliefs, and we want to create the things that we carried forth by the next generation of JavaScripters, by the next generation of developers, in a future that's so distant that we probably can't really imagine it. So I think JavaScript is open to everybody, and one of JavaScript's most compelling features is actually this openness. It's before we've written our first function, a lot of people are using view source and trying to figure out how does that work, what did that do, and what's happening here. But it's before we've even written our first function. It's when we're just sort of curious and we're sort of looking around and trying to figure out what's happening. It's this point, we might not actually consider ourselves developers yet, but it's this curiosity. It's this desire to understand that makes you enough, and it gives you membership in the community. And so all too often we hear this chorus of people who say, I'd like to erect some barriers. I'd like to set some limitations on the membership of the JavaScript community, on the membership of the developer community. And so we sort of say, these people, they're not developers. They don't belong here, and here's why. They don't use JavaScript the way that I use JavaScript. Or they don't struggle with the same concepts that I'm struggling with. They're just sort of pretending. And I think that's just, it's really, really dangerous, because as we sort of set up these rules, as we try and define the JavaScript community and the developer community in this really broad way, we run into some problems. Why is it that we're trying to guard against people joining? And I think it's probably because we have this broad definition that we feel a little bit worried. It's because when we define communities so broadly, It includes sort of a 10-year-old kid that I taught how to hack on his math homework with JavaScript. It includes designers who are writing primarily CSS and not JavaScript. And maybe they know just enough JavaScript to sort of make things work. It includes people who are art majors. And maybe they're just sort of learning a little bit of JavaScript on the side. And they're trying to figure out, OK, what am I going to do after college? And it even includes people that go to code school. And what I don't mean is as soon as they graduate and they've made this great portfolio, what I actually mean is that they've gotten curious and they've started on this path. And they're members of the JavaScript community on the first day of class before they've ever built their first website, before they've ever graduated, before they've really even started. So this sort of thinking that we can control who joins, that we can set up these rules, is just, it's sort of silly. And it's limiting, it's defeating, it's wrong. Your age, your background, your job title, your occupation, how you earn your money, even your ability to sort of comprehend what's going on in JavaScript all of the time and take advantage of it as a language, that doesn't define your membership in the community. Your desire to understand what's going on with JavaScript, that is enough. So how do we lead a community that's so broad? How do we lead a community that's so diverse? How do we lead a community that's so vast? And how do we ensure that JavaScript and the developer community in general are inclusive and they're kind places and they're places where we want to work? So earlier I said, let's talk about the idea of legacy. And so now I think it's time to also examine the meaning of the word leadership. So leadership is an act or an instance of leading. A leader is someone who provides guidance or direction, but let's sort of step back a little bit and let's think about it a little bit more. An act or an instance, it's a fleeting moment. If we sort of dive in a little bit deeper, what we find is that leadership isn't a status that's granted after months and months and months or years of working and gaining recognition. Leadership can actually be really, really fleeting. It can happen really fast and then just go right back away. And this definition of leadership is really incredible because what happens is that by defining leadership in this way, it becomes really empowering. And because you can truly be a leader in the JavaScript community, you don't need to be on stage. You don't need to have a lot of Twitter followers. You don't need a blog. You don't need a really deep understanding of JavaScript. You can just do something right in that instant, in that moment. And for that moment, you're a leader. So I think, of course, there's other stuff like there's technical leadership, for example, and there's researching, understanding the costs and benefits of why is one framework better than another, or you can talk really confidently about a particular thing or a project that you did. But being a leader is just showing leadership in that moment, and it doesn't always have to be technical. And often, being a leader just means doing the right thing right then. And so it could look like making space for a marginalized member of our community to speak. It could mean listening, even when you think you already know better than everyone else. It could mean making the effort to use the correct pronouns, or it could mean making the effort to correctly pronounce someone's name. And that's really, really important when we're in a community that's so broad and so diverse and comes from so many different places and countries. Getting these little details right, focusing on the people behind the community is super crucial. So being a leader doesn't mean being the loudest voice in the room. It doesn't mean having the most experience. Being a leader actually just means helping other people learn. It means creating this culture where it's acceptable to just not know things, to have not figured things out yet. It's creating a culture where making a mistake doesn't result in you being punished or some sort of retribution, but instead in giving kind and constructive feedback and helping people learn and helping people figure things out. And so being a leader doesn't mean these really, really big things that sometimes we have in our heads. Being a leader actually is just doing the right thing when it's difficult, and especially when it's difficult. So there's another little harder thing that I'd also like to talk about, and that's barriers to entry. Before we sort of keep going, I'd like to sort of take a step back and acknowledge that there's a really unfortunate part of the tech community as a whole, and that's that leadership and even participation in code and development and writing all of this stuff and sort of determining this future, it's not attainable to everybody. And is really incredibly disheartening. So I would say that the boundaries that are faced by the members of the JavaScript community they're just unjustified. They're harmful, and they're harmful not just on an individual basis, because they obstruct sort of the access and the progress of that one person, but also because they're harmful to our community as a whole. And so it's the obligation of those of us with power, it's the obligation of those of us with a voice and with privilege to remove barriers and to sort of look into what can be seen as a barrier, but also maybe something that's a little bit more intangible, a little bit less visible, and to say, hey, I want to really support you. I want to really encourage those people who have maybe faced obstacles that we haven't ourselves had to overcome. So we can create real change. And I would say that as the language of the web, JavaScript is really uniquely positioned to affect change in the broader programming community. And the reason I think that is because when we look back on the people and the technologies that came before us, a lot of times we're sort of tricked. And it's easy to believe that the blog posts that we read and the podcasts that we listen to and the NPM packages that we download and the GitHub repositories that we're always searching for, it's super easy to believe that these things are just always going to be there. And the meetups where we meet people or the conferences where we go and learn, it's easy to think, oh yeah, I missed it this time, but I'll go again. It'll always be there. And that's problematic because these things are not always going to be there. And the reason is that these things are all built by the community. And the JavaScript community, like all communities, is made up of individuals. And we're building products, we're building tools, we're even building sort of the language of the future. And when we're shaping it in new and exciting ways, I think it's really important, again, to just focus on the people. So in closing, I'd like to leave you all with this. When you wake up in the morning, what I want you to ask yourself as you're getting ready for the day is to think about what it is that you can contribute to the legacy of the JavaScript community, the legacy of the programming community as a whole. Each of us possess really interesting and different skills, and we have different ideas on how best to lead, different ideas on where our community should go. So what is it that you can contribute to the community? And I would say that the beauty of JavaScript, the beauty of the programming community that we've built and this technology that we love is that by each of us doing our part, by each of us leading and contributing in different ways, what actually happens is that instead of sort of working from this position where we're trying to disguise our diversity, instead we should try to highlight diversity, and we should try to create something, a little bit of magic where JavaScript and programming sort of becomes this living legacy. And our shared vision of JavaScript as a language and as a community sort of comes to life, and it becomes, what I said before, a body of persons that were sent on a mission, not just to shape the world, not just through code, but also by our vision for the future of the language and the community of the people that surround it. Thank you. Questions?